Herodotus of Halicarnassus here displays his inquiries that human achievement may be spared the ravages of time, and that everything great and astounding, and all the glory of those exploits which serve to display Greeks and barbarians alike to such effect, be kept alive, and additionally, and most importantly, to give the reason they went to war. Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor. And it's time for the Sunday Penguin once again. Yes, it's time for the Sunday Penguin. And we are continuing on with our thrilling series, Ancient Penguins. Last week it was Homer, and this week it is Herodotus. Herodotus, Herodotus, the father of history, according to Cicero. And I think he was right, Cicero, about Herodotus being the father of history, because he wrote the very first history in Western literature, at least that we recognize as a history. It has everything in there that you require from a history and a whole lot more. So Herodotus, this Greek from Halicarnassus, which is now part of Turkey, he lives in what is now Turkey, or he lived in what is now Turkey. Born probably somewhere around 490 BC, am I right? Yes, somewhere around there. We don't know exactly when, because we don't know a heck of a lot about Herodotus himself as far as the details of his life. There's been a lot said about Herodotus, but we don't have a lot of facts. A lot of times when ancient Greeks were to write biographies of people and they didn't really have the facts, they made up facts. And so we don't really know a lot of detail about this guy's life. But we do get a lot of information about his personality, because his personality really shines through in this history, more so than in a lot of ancient writers. He puts a lot of himself in this work, and he talks a lot about himself as far as what his thoughts are, what his opinions are, and some of the places that he traveled, because Herodotus traveled all around the Greek and Persian world. So we don't know if Herodotus was perhaps a merchant, or if he was just a really well-off Greek who could afford to travel around all over the place, collecting information for his history. This is very clearly his life's work. This is a life's work, this book. Now, as I've mentioned before, this is my favorite book of all time. I love this book. I think it is an incredible achievement. It's important because it doesn't just give us the history of the Persian War. It gives us a lot of information about all of the cultures that are involved in this war, because he was interested in culture. He gives you a lot of stories, a lot of folk tales, a lot of myths, a lot of information about the flora and fauna of the different areas that he's talking about, a lot of background on the cultures. Whatever history was known about the cultures he was talking about, he would tell you that anything he found out. And interestingly, Herodotus, unlike a lot of later historians, will give you more than one version of a story sometimes. And if he thinks that the story is not true, he'll tell you the story, and then he'll say, you know what? I told you this story because I'm duty-bound to tell you, that this is the tradition of this culture or the story from this culture, but I don't buy it. I think it's nonsense. Which is interesting, because he did feel, Herodotus did, that whatever stories he would come across regarding the cultures he was talking about and the history that he was talking about, even if he didn't believe it himself, he felt like he should pass this information on to you. And he tells you straight up, you have to make your own decision about whether you think this is true or not. I'll pass on this information or this story, and you can decide whether you think it's true. It was an interesting way to do things, and I'm grateful that he did it, and a lot of us who are interested in ancient history are pretty happy with that, because he passes on a lot of information that might have been ignored or not bothered with by other historians later on, more serious historians like Thucydides, for example. And all of that stuff is valuable because it would have been lost without Herodotus. All of those stories, all of that stuff that he's talking about in these cultures, it all would have been, it wouldn't exist today without him. So it's really, really important. So he tells this history and he puts all of these stories throughout this history. It's a very entertaining read. It's one of the most entertaining books you could read from the ancient world. And that's why so many of us who love ancient history love this book. It's just packed full of so much stuff that is so great. Herodotus' The Histories. But you might wonder, well, what edition should I read if I'm interested in reading Herodotus? And there are a few choices. Now, this is the Sunday Penguin, so I'm going to be talking about the Penguin editions that are available. And there are 2 of them that are available at this time. And of course, there is another version which I think in a lot of ways is better than the Penguin versions, and I'll talk about that too. But this is the Penguin version. This is an older edition of it, obviously. This is the older edition of Herodotus that is translated by Aubrey De Selincourt. This particular version was revised with introductory matter and notes by John Marincola. But the De Selincourt translation is one of the most popular translations of Herodotus that you can get. It's very highly regarded, the De Selincourt translation. And it's been in print for years and years just because it is so readable and it is so popular. And I believe, in fact, I know you can still get this. This is still the Black Spine Classic version that Penguin has available. Probably the exact same version that was revised by John Marincola. I don't know if it's been further revised for the newer editions. It's possible. But yeah, if you're going to pick up a Black Spine Classic of Herodotus, it's probably going to be the De Selincourt translation. And as a translation, it's excellent. You can't do much better than this translation as far as just a readable, entertaining translation, which is faithful to the text. Faithful enough that he's telling you what Herodotus was telling you, basically. But there is a newer version that you can get from Penguin, which is this version. This version is available in Penguin Classics. Their deluxe edition reprints this edition. And this is the translation by Tom Holland, which came out a few years ago. So this is a newer translation of Herodotus by Tom Holland. And it's got some critical flack, this one has. There are a lot of people that don't like this translation, and the reason for that is that Tom Holland, when he translates, he puts in a lot of modern words and some modern slang, which is a bit jarring at times if you're just expecting to read an ancient book written by someone from the ancient world. There are terms that he uses in here that, of course, would not be used by Herodotus. But then Herodotus wasn't speaking English anyway. He was speaking ancient Greek. So as a translator, you've got to try to decide how close you're going to stick to the original text. You have to make a determination how closely you're going to stick to the text or how much you're going to change it in order to make it readable and accessible to an English audience. Or an audience that reads English, anyway. And so when Tom Holland got a hold of this and he translated it, he did a very chatty, entertaining translation with a lot of modern words that a lot of scholars, for example, didn't like. A lot of people didn't like, just because of, all of those things. However, in my opinion, it works. It works. It's a pretty entertaining translation, and it does say what Herodotus said, basically. He just says it in a modern way. And I'll get to that in a minute. I'll talk a little bit more about the translation and some of the differences. Before that, however, I've got to mention that as far as Herodotus goes, the best version you can get is this version. This is the Landmark Herodotus, edited by Robert B. Strassler, and I've talked about this edition before. This has a translation by Andrea L. Purvis. The reason this is the best edition is because of all of the supplementary material in this. There's a ton of it. And if you're reading Herodotus for the first time, that's very helpful. What is most helpful is the maps, or are the maps, that you could find in this volume. There are maps all over this thing, as well as being some handy illustrations all over the text, which gives you a sense of the history of the whole thing. But the maps are probably the most important, because with Herodotus, he's talking a lot about people and places that don't exist anymore, or places whose names have changed. And so if you're just a regular American or English reader who's reading this, you're probably not going to know where a lot of these places are or were. And so it's very handy to have these maps spread throughout the text that will show you exactly where everything was. Of course, now I can't find maps when I'm going, here we go. So it's handy to have all of those maps just all over the text to tell you where everything is. Now, that is the problem with this particular edition, the Black Spine edition. Now, I don't know if the maps have been updated or not, but in the edition I have, all the maps are in the front. And they're just pretty basic maps. Like you can tell that they come from different sources and they were just kind of stuck in here. And there's no map index, and they're not, to be helpful, this should have an index and maybe a grid so that you can look up the place name that's in the text and find it easily, but it doesn't. It just has a map, has a couple of maps in the front, so that if you want to find something, you just have to like hope for the best and just scan each map until you find what you're looking for, which is a pain in the ass. And so that is the weakness to this particular edition. And like I said, I don't know if the newer edition of this has changed that at all. I hope that they have, because this edition, which is the deluxe edition now, this is the original hardcover of that. But this edition has maps in the back, if I can find them. Where are you, maps? Here you are. This edition has maps in the back. It does have a map index, which is nice. So it's going to make it easier to find the different places. And I have to say, the maps in this version are really, really nice. They are very good maps. Still, it could have used a grid system so that you could find the places more easily, but at least it has a map index which will show you which map to look on for whatever place you're looking for. And this has a generous supply of maps in the back, which is very helpful. And like I said, they're high quality maps. So this edition does get that right as far as the maps are concerned. Still nowhere near as good as the Landmark edition, but at least you could probably find what you're looking for. The Landmark edition, this edition has a lot more information. It has a ton of appendices in the back. It has a lot of notes on the text, maybe too much. But for a first-time reader, this is very, very helpful. The translation is not as good as the De Selincourt translation. This translation is a little wooden if you compare the translation to the other two. It's not as entertaining a translation as the other two translations are. So as a reader just reading the text, the other two books are better, or the other two translations are better than this. This gives you all of the information that you need. It tells you what Herodotus is telling you. It just doesn't do it with any flair or style. And that's the thing, because Herodotus, you get a sense, had flair and style. And so that is actually captured a lot better in the translations in these volumes. And I actually would recommend either one of these translations. So if you don't know any of the history or the places, this version is handy to have. For actually just reading the text, the other two are better. And I actually, for just a modern reader, this one actually might be the way to go, actually, if you just want to read the text and see what Herodotus is saying in an entertaining way. And that's going to be scandalous to a lot of Herodotus fans because of some of the modernisms, for example. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of that from Tom Holland. Well, this is where it's talking about some of the Persian stories. In the beginning, it says, well-informed Persian commentators pin the blame for the clash on the Phoenicians. Commentators is not a word you would normally associate with ancient Greeks or Greece or the ancient Persians. But he uses the word ancient Greek commentators, which is odd. But it does work because it's kind of true. And there's another part here where it says, where it's talking about some women that are about to be kidnapped and are kidnapped. These women were standing around the ship's stern, haggling over the various items that had particularly caught their fancy, when the Phoenicians, who had already tipped the nod to one another, made a sudden rush at them. Tipped the nod is an odd choice of slang, which we in America do not use that term, at least as far as I'm aware. But it might be an English thing. But that is an odd choice. If you go to the De Selincourt for those two sections, it's a little bit different. Where Tom Holland had commentators, this is how De Selincourt says that. Learned Persians, he just calls them learned or learned Persians, put the responsibility for the quarrel on the Phoenicians. So that's different than commentators. And when the women are being kidnapped, this is how he describes that scene. These women were standing about near the vessel's stern, buying what they fancied, when suddenly the Phoenician sailors passed the word along and made a rush at them. So they just passed the word along. They didn't tip the nod. So De Selincourt is telling you the same thing that Tom Holland does. He just does it in a much different way. He is chatty, De Selincourt, but he's a little more conservative in the way he says it. Where Tom Holland does read a lot more modern. But they're saying the same thing, basically. And this might be a more entertaining way to read it. And it has those great maps. So out of the two Penguin Classics versions, if you're a first-time reader, this is great. This might be a bit better, though, as far as just the average reader reading Herodotus for the first time and wanting to read the histories. This might be a better way to go than this one. Again, that's going to be blasphemy for some fans of Herodotus. I like them both, actually. I like the landmark Herodotus, the book, better, but as far as the translations, these are much better translations. And either one are serviceable. You can't go wrong with either one. And I would highly, highly recommend you read this book, that you read the histories, because it is a fantastic experience and kind of essential, really. If you're interested in classic literature at all, you've got to read the histories. I mean, you just got to. Besides, it's so much fun. And this is the fun version, probably, of the histories translated by Tom Holland. So there you go. It's the Histories by Herodotus. I'll shut up now since I've been going on for 20 minutes. Catch me next week when we discuss Thucydides. That'll be extra fun. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.